Have you ever seen a moment so powerful it felt like the entire world stopped holding its breath? Imagine a quiet hospital room filled with soft, sterile light, the steady beeping of machines the only proof of life inside. Now picture a young woman, Emily, just 25, who once had the brightest laugh, the kind of laugh you could hear across a room and feel in your heart. But after a devastating car accident, that voice was gone. Doctors whispered the same words over and over to her parents. She would never speak again. Her vocal cords, they said, were too damaged. Her brain too traumatized. And so Emily sat day after day in silence, trapped in her own mind. Her eyes saying everything her voice no longer could. Her parents tried everything. Speech therapy, specialists in other states, even experimental techniques, but nothing worked. She didn't even try to move her lips anymore. She would just stare out the hospital window at the gray sky, lost somewhere only she could see. But what no one knew was that outside that same window, on the sidewalk that ran along the hospital lawn, a golden retriever sat, day after day. Rain, wind, or shine, the dog never moved. No collar, no leash, no owner in sight, just those warm amber eyes locked on the same window where Emily always sat. Nurses began to notice. They'd whisper as they passed the hallways, "That dog is here again," like he's waiting for something. Some even left scraps of food for him, but he rarely touched them. He didn't bark, he didn't run, he just waited. Inside Emily's room, her mother, Susan, tried to bring life back to her daughter. She played soft piano music, read her favorite childhood stories aloud, even brought her old photo albums hoping for a spark of recognition. But Emily's gaze stayed empty. One rainy afternoon, while Susan sat quietly holding Emily's hand, she saw the faintest movement outside the window. She turned and saw the dog, sitting in the rain, fur-soaked, but still staring straight through the glass at Emily. Susan stood, walked to the window, and for the first time, Emily blinked. Her gaze shifted slowly toward the dog. It was so subtle Susan almost missed it, but there was something in Emily's eyes, like a tiny flicker of something long forgotten. The next morning, the dog was still there. The hospital staff began to call him Hope because he simply wouldn't leave. Word spread through the building and soon the entire floor knew about the golden retriever. Who wouldn't he move? One nurse suggested, almost as a joke, "Maybe we should let him in." At first, no one took it seriously. It was against hospital policy, of course, but when the head nurse saw Emily look toward the window again, really look, she made a call. Susan's heart pounded as she stood by Emily's bedside later that afternoon. She didn't know if this was a mistake, but she felt she had nothing left to lose. Moments later, the door opened and in walked the dog. His wet paws padded softly across the cold tile floor, his tail low but wagging gently, his eyes warm and focused only on Emily. The room was silent, even the machine seemed to fade into the background. The dog stopped just inches from Emily's bed, lifted his head, and let out the softest sound, a quiet whimper, almost like a question. And then, for the first time in 6 months, Emily moved. She slowly raised her trembling hand and rested it on the dog's head. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Her mother gasped, covering her mouth. And then, the impossible happened. Emily's lips parted. No words came out, just a faint, breathy sound, but it was the first attempt at speech since the accident. The doctors couldn't believe it. Something inside her had shifted. This dog she had never met had reached her in a place no one else could. From that day forward, the golden retriever never left Emily's side. Nurses made a special pass so he could stay in the room. Every morning, he would gently nudge her arm, and every evening, he would curl up beside her bed. The doctors still doubted she would ever fully recover her voice, but Emily started trying again. Little sounds at first, then whispers, and every time she tried, the dog would perk up and wag his tail, as if cheering her on. Soon, physical therapists noticed something remarkable. Her whole body was responding, her posture improved, her eyes brightened, and she even started smiling again. It was as if the presence of the dog unlocked a part of her that was frozen. And then came the day Susan will never forget. One sunny morning, She walked into the hospital room and found Emily sitting upright with the dog beside her. The window was open just slightly and a soft breeze filled the room. Emily turned, looked straight at her mother, and in the faintest, raspiest voice whispered a single word, "Mom." Susan dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The nurses who witnessed it later said it was like watching a miracle unfold. News of Emily and the mysterious golden retriever spread beyond the hospital. Reporters started showing up wanting to know where the dog came from. No one knew. He had no tags, no microchip, nothing to identify him. It was as if he appeared out of nowhere just to save her. But there was still more to this story. Because one day, while Emily continued her therapy with the dog by her side, an elderly man showed up at the hospital lobby holding an old photograph. In it was the same golden retriever, sitting beside his late wife, who had been a speech therapist for children years ago. "His name is Chance," the man said quietly, tears in his eyes. "He was my wife's therapy dog. He's always been drawn to people who need him the most." And at that moment, everything clicked. This dog had chosen Emily, just like he had chosen countless others before. But the story didn't end there. What happened in the weeks that followed would touch the lives of everyone in the hospital and beyond, because when Emily finally spoke her first full sentence, it wasn't to a doctor or a nurse. It was to the dog who saved her voice. Emily's voice was fragile, soft like the first crack of light at dawn, but it was there, and the word she spoke was simple yet carried the weight of everything she'd endured. "Thank you." Those two words weren't directed at her mother or the doctors. They were for the golden retriever sitting calmly by her bedside, gazing at her with those warm amber eyes that seemed to hold an endless well of understanding. From that moment, Emily's recovery took on a rhythm no medical plan could have predicted. Each day, therapists would enter her room expecting slow progress, but when the dog was there, it was like he was rewriting the rules. When Emily practiced simple vowel sounds, the dog would tilt his head and wag his tail encouragingly, and when she managed to form faint words, he would nuzzle her hand softly. And every time she laughed at his gentle antics, the entire room would feel lighter. Soon, the hospital staff began scheduling their rounds to make sure they could pass by her room, not because they were required to, but because the sight of Emily trying and the dog quietly supporting her was something they didn't want to miss. Word spread so quickly that other patients on the floor started asking to meet the golden retriever they called the healer. Children would smile just by seeing him, elderly patients would pet him and tell stories they hadn't shared in years, and even the most stoic doctors would pose just to watch. Meanwhile, Emily's mother, Susan, started to see glimmers of the daughter she thought she had lost forever. It wasn't just the words returning, it was the spark in Emily's eyes. The small smile she gave when she realized she'd said something new, the way her fingers slowly regained strength from petting the dog for hours each day. And then came a day that no one could have prepared for. It was a rainy afternoon, soft drizzles painting streaks across the hospital window. Emily was sitting up in bed with the dog resting his chin on her lap. A speech therapist had brought in a simple storybook, the kind children read out loud to practice sounds. Susan handed it to her daughter gently, never expecting much. But Emily, holding the book in her trembling hands, looked at the first page, took a deep breath, and whispered the words. It wasn't perfect, her voice cracked and paused, but she read the first line out loud. The therapist froze, Susan gasped, and the dog simply looked up at her with what could only be described as pride. From that day, the book became their ritual. Every morning, Emily would read a little more, and the dog would stay perfectly still as if soaking in every word. Doctors who had once said she'd never speak again now had no explanation. They ran tests, checked her vocal cords, reviewed her brain scans, and every time they'd shrug, amazed. They said it defied logic, that it was emotional healing beyond what science could measure. But for Susan, it wasn't a mystery at all. It was love, pure, quiet, and wavering love that came in the form of a dog who refused to leave her side. Weeks turned into months, and Emily grew stronger. Her voice gained more clarity, her words came more easily, and she even started to joke softly with the nurses. One morning, Susan entered the room to find Emily humming softly as she brushed the dog's fur. It was faint and shaky, but it was music, and it was hers. Outside the room, the hospital board had a meeting about the golden retriever. People wanted to know his story, where he came from, how he chose Emily. That's when the elderly man, the one who first identified him as Chance, shared something no one knew. Years ago, Chance had been trained as a companion for his late wife, who worked with children who had lost the ability to speak after trauma. She used to say, "Chance doesn't just listen with his ears. He listens with his soul." After she passed away, Chance disappeared one day, leaving the man heartbroken. But now it was the first time Emily left her hospital bed. It wasn't part of any planned physical therapy session. It was because Chance, the golden retriever, who had never left her side, stood at the edge of her bed one bright afternoon, nudged her hand gently with his nose, and then stepped back as if inviting her to follow. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines, and Susan, sitting in the corner, looked up, puzzled. Emily blinked at him, and sure, but when Chance took another step back, tilting his head in that way only dogs can, something inside her shifted. She placed both hands on the bed rails, hesitated, and then, without a single word, swung her legs over the side. Her feet touched the cold tile floor for the first time in months, and though her legs trembled, she kept her eyes locked on Chance. It was as if his calm, steady gaze told her, "I'll catch you if you fall." Slowly, Emily stood. The room held its breath. Susan's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't dare speak. The nurses who had just walked in froze in the doorway, unsure if they should move or stay still. And then Emily took one step, then another. Inching forward until her hands found Chance's soft golden fur, she leaned on him lightly, like he was the anchor she needed to find her balance. And in that moment the hospital didn't feel like a sterile building filled with rules and routines. It felt alive, witnessing a miracle unfold right before their eyes. From that day forward, Emily's therapy became something entirely different. It was no longer confined to exercise, equipment, and checklists. Instead, every morning, she and Chance would walk down the long hallway lined with windows, the sunlight spilling across the floors like a golden path just for them. He would move at her exact pace, never too fast, never too slow, always pausing when she needed to rest. Other patients would peek out of their rooms to watch her, their faces lighting up with quiet hope. Children waved shyly, and even the most reserved doctors couldn't help but smile as they passed. And something even more remarkable began happening. Chance's presence wasn't just healing Emily. It was changing the entire hospital. Patients who hadn't spoken in weeks began whispering his name. A teenager recovering from surgery, who refused to eat, finally smiled and shared a piece of her sandwich with him. An elderly man, who hadn't moved from his wheelchair since a stroke, lifted his hand just to pet him. The staff started noticing patterns wherever Chance went. The air felt lighter, calmer, as if he carried a kind of quiet magic with him. But for Emily, Chance wasn't magic. He was family. As her voice grew stronger, she began reading aloud to him every day. Not children's books anymore, but longer stories filled with laughter and adventure. And each time she stumbled on a word, Chance would simply nuzzle her hand as if to say, "It's okay, try again." Slowly, her confidence returned, and so did her spirit. Months passed, and finally, the day came when Emily was discharged. The entire hospital staff lined the hallways to see her off, clapping softly as she walked toward the main doors with Chance beside her. No wheelchair, no walker, just steady steps and a gentle smile. Susan cried openly, holding the paperwork in one hand and her daughter's backpack in the other. Outside, the air smelled like freedom, and for the first time in so long, Emily lifted her face to the sun without fear. But even as they left the hospital, Emily knew she couldn't just let Chance walk away. He had given her more than any doctor ever could: her voice, her strength, her hope. So when the elderly man who had once owned Chance came to visit, Emily took his hand in hers and whispered, "Please, can he stay with me?" The man, with tears in his eyes, nodded. He explained softly that Chance had always had a way of finding the people who needed him most. He was never really his dog. He belonged to everyone who had lost a piece of themselves and needed help finding it again. That day, Chance officially became part of their family. Back home, things felt strange at first. Emily had left the hospital walls behind, but she still carried quiet shadows in her heart. Yet Chance was there every morning, waiting by her bedroom door, ready to take another walk, ready to listen to another story. And with each passing day, Emily spoke more, laughed more, lived more. Then one evening, Susan suggested something unexpected. "Emily," she said gently, "what if we visit the school? Just to say hello." Emily hesitated. The idea of walking through those hallways again was daunting, but Chance nudged her hand, and Emily nodded. The next morning, they went. When Emily stepped into her old classroom, the other students froze. No one knew what to say, until Chance trotted in and laid down at her feet. That broke the silence. Slowly, her classmates gathered around, asking questions, sharing stories, and welcoming her back. Emily spoke softly at first, then louder, until the room was filled with the sound of laughter and relief. It was like a piece of her life had been returned. But what no one expected was what happened next. Emily and Susan started visiting other hospitals and schools with Chance, sharing their story, showing families that healing doesn't always come from medicine alone. It comes from love, from connection, from a bond so strong it can bring back a voice that was thought lost forever. And soon, they weren't just helping one child, they were helping many. Children who had stopped speaking after trauma, patients who had lost their will to recover, people who thought they were alone. All of them found hope in the gentle gaze of a golden retriever named Chance. Emily realized she hadn't just been given her voice back, she had been given a purpose. And it all began with a dog who refused to leave her side. Emily never imagined that one hospital stay would turn into something bigger than herself. But as the weeks passed, the calls started coming in. Parents asking if Chance could visit their children. Teachers requesting him for special assemblies. Doctors quietly admitting that sometimes medicine could only go so far. And what really helped patients heal was hope. Emily and Susan decided to say yes. Not because they wanted attention, but because they knew what it felt like to be on the other side, sitting in silence, thinking you might never speak or laugh again. So they created something called Chance's Circle. A simple idea at first. Just visiting children who had lost their voice, not always literally but emotionally too, children who stopped talking after trauma, or who were too sick to smile. Chance would walk in gently. No loud barks, no pressure, just presence. And slowly, like magic, something inside those children would shift. Emily saw it again and again. A little boy in a wheelchair who had been silent for 6 months whispered high into Chance's ear. A teenage girl recovering from surgery for a rare illness started drawing again when Chance lay quietly beside her bed. Even elderly patients at a memory care home who no longer recognized their families would suddenly light up and stroke Chance's soft golden fur. Everywhere he went, Chance gave people a reason to breathe a little easier. One day, a nurse from the same hospital where Emily had once stayed asked if Chance could come for a reunion event. Emily agreed, and when they arrived, it felt like stepping back into another lifetime. The staff lined the halls, many of them tearing up as they saw Emily walking confidently, her voice strong, her smile bright. They had witnessed her darkest moments. And now they were seeing her as living proof that healing was possible. In the children's ward, a little girl named Lily clutched a stuffed toy but wouldn't speak to anyone. She had been through countless surgeries, and her parents had almost given up hope of hearing her voice again. Emily knelt beside Lily, placing Chance's paw gently on the bed. "He helped me when I couldn't talk," Emily whispered softly. "Maybe he can help you too." Lily hesitated, her tiny fingers brushing the dog's fur. And then, in the faintest voice, she said, "Doggy." Her parents gasped. Tears filled their eyes. That single word cracked open a dam of emotions. And it reminded everyone in the room why they believed in miracles. From that day forward, Chance's visits became a regular part of the hospital's recovery program. And Emily, who once thought she would never live a normal life again, became an ambassador for therapy dog programs across the state. News outlets picked up their story. A short video of Chance helping Lily speak went viral online, reaching millions of people who were inspired by the quiet, unshakable bond between a child and a dog. Letters poured in from around the world. Families shared their own stories of how animals had healed them in ways no one could explain. Some even adopted rescue dogs in honor of Chance, saying they wanted to give another animal the chance to change a life. Emily and Susan were invited to speak at schools, not just about therapy dogs but about kindness, patience, and never giving up on someone who seems lost. And everywhere they went, Chance was there too, his calm golden eyes meeting the gaze of each person who needed him most. Over time, Emily's life blossomed in ways she couldn't have dreamed. She went back to school, made new friends, and even joined a volunteer group that paired students with therapy animals. But no matter how busy life became, she always made time for the simple moments, reading stories to Chance under the oak tree in their backyard, long walks through the park where she used to sit silently, afraid she'd never walk freely again, and quiet nights at home where Chance would rest his head on her lap while she talked about her day. One evening, Susan sat with Emily on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. "You know," Susan said softly, "you saved each other." Emily looked at Chance, who was lying at her feet, his tail thumping gently. "No," she replied, her voice full of gratitude. "He saved me first, and now we're saving others." As the seasons changed, so did the scope of their mission. What started as small visits turned into a community project, then a nonprofit organization that trained more dogs like Chance to help children and families heal. Emily never called herself a hero. She always said the real hero had for paws and a heart big enough to carry the pain of everyone he met. But those who saw her speak, who heard her story, knew it was more than just the dog. It was the bond between them, unspoken but unbreakable, that gave hope to anyone who had ever felt trapped in silence. And so, wherever they went, whether it was a crowded hospital room or a quiet classroom, people would stop and watch as Chance padded gently inside. They would see Emily walk behind him, strong and smiling, and realize that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles come not from medicine or science but from love, patience, and a dog who simply refuses to leave your side.